Pause for a moment and settle your breath. Something subtle has already begun to shift in the unseen layers around your life. If you've been experiencing an unusual emotional gravity lately, if your mind keeps drifting back to one particular person without any clear reason, if your intuition keeps hinting that something is quietly changing beneath the surface, then this message may be aligning with your experience for a reason. Because the connection you feel is not as still as it once seemed. Your soulmate is starting to lose their ability to regulate what they feel for you. And the way this unfolds next could reshape everything between you. Not in some distant, undefined future, but much sooner than your logical mind expects. There is a reason their energy feels more present in your awareness lately. A reason their silence doesn't feel empty anymore, but charged, as if something unspoken is building pressure between you. A reason the emotional distance suddenly feels different, almost alive, as though something invisible is gathering momentum underneath the surface of your daily reality. What you are sensing did not appear randomly. Your soulmate has been attempting for a long time to hold their emotions in check. They've tried to appear unaffected, to convince themselves that what they feel could be managed, delayed, or eventually faded out with enough time and separation. On the surface, they may have acted as though distance would weaken the connection, but the opposite has been happening. The more they resisted what they feel for you, the more intense the bond became internally. Let that settle for a moment. Every effort to suppress the connection did not reduce it, it strengthened it. What may have started as something they labeled lightly, attraction, curiosity, a passing emotional pull, has gradually deepened into something that occupies their inner world far more than they expected. It began following them into quiet moments, into the pauses between thoughts, into nights where sleep doesn't fully arrive, into busy environments where their attention still slips away for a second without warning. Even in ordinary routines, something about you returns to their awareness, uninvited but persistent. And slowly, one presence becomes harder to ignore than anything else. Yours. This is where their internal control begins to fracture, because not all connections behave in predictable ways. Some bonds don't wait for permission. Some people enter your emotional field and quietly reorganize everything you thought was stable. And in their experience, you are becoming exactly that kind of presence. You were never meant to be something forgettable to them. Take a moment with that realization. Even if they appear distant outwardly, even if they maintain a composed or indifferent exterior, that does not reflect their inner state. Beneath the surface presentation, there has been emotional turbulence, an ongoing conflict they haven't fully expressed or resolved. Every delayed reply, every moment of hesitation, every inconsistent reaction has not been emptiness, it has been internal friction. A quiet struggle between avoidance and feeling, between control and emotional pull, between what they think they should do and what they actually feel. Because deep down, your soulmate is beginning to understand something that unsettles them. This is not ordinary attraction anymore. It is not temporary fascination. It is not a connection that fits neatly into logic or casual emotional categories. It feels different, irreplaceable, unrepeatable. And that recognition creates discomfort, because anything that cannot be explained easily forces a person to question themselves. And when someone is forced into that level of inner questioning, their first instinct is rarely surrender. It is resistance. Not because the connection is wrong, but because it demands change. To acknowledge what they feel for you fully would mean confronting themselves honestly. It would require them to stop avoiding certain truths, to stop maintaining emotional distance as protection, and to stop holding on to versions of themselves that no longer align with what this connection is awakening in them. And that is exactly what they have been afraid of. Because stepping toward you emotionally does not feel small to them. It feels irreversible. It feels like crossing into a version of life where they cannot return to emotional neutrality, where denial is no longer an option, where pretending becomes impossible. But here is the shift that is now beginning to form. Fear is slowly losing its dominance over desire, and that changes everything. Over time, the emotional exhaustion of avoidance begins to outweigh the fear that created it. The effort it takes to suppress what they feel becomes heavier than the risk of acknowledging it. Silence starts to feel less like protection and more like pressure. Distance stops feeling safe and starts feeling emotionally loud. Your soulmate is approaching that threshold now, and you may already be noticing the early signs of this internal change. Their energy feels less predictable. Their presence seems to echo in unexpected moments. Certain reminders of them appear without warning. Their name or memory surfaces in your awareness more frequently than coincidence would suggest. Something between you is no longer staying still. It is moving. The universe seems to keep dropping reminders of them into your path at the most unexpected moments. And that doesn't sit well with coincidence. It feels like something is shifting underneath the surface, like emotional movement that hasn't fully revealed itself yet, but is already in motion. Inside them, something has been quietly intensifying for a long time. Pressure, longing, emotional urgency, recognition they can no longer fully dismiss. They are starting to understand something they once avoided. The pain of losing you would cut deeper than the fear of opening up ever could. And once a person reaches that inner realization, emotional restraint doesn't hold the same strength anymore. It begins to crack in subtle but irreversible ways. That is why whatever happens next won't feel casual. It won't carry emotional neutrality. It won't come from a place of indifference. It will come from the breaking point of someone who can no longer contain what they already know inside. You may assume they are calm. They are not. You may assume they have moved on. They haven't. You may assume your absence has become insignificant to them. It hasn't. Because no one who is emotionally untouched keeps circling back to the same presence in thought, memory, and quiet internal reflection. No one who feels nothing experiences this kind of internal repetition. Your soulmate isn't losing interest. They are losing emotional control. And when emotional control starts slipping under the weight of real feeling, something becomes inevitable. Movement. Not planned movement, not polished or emotionally perfect movement, but honest movement. Raw, unfiltered, undeniable movement that comes from pressure finally reaching its limit. So if your intuition has been telling you that something is approaching, don't dismiss it so quickly. If something inside you has been sensing a turning point forming between you, pay attention to that inner signal. Because often the heart registers shifts long before the mind can explain them. What they do next may feel like confirmation. Confirmation that the emotions became too strong to suppress any longer. Confirmation that your absence started to matter more than they expected. Confirmation that something in this connection has already changed them internally in ways they can't easily undo. And this is only the beginning of that realization unfolding. Because what they are experiencing right now is not stillness. It only appears that way on the surface. Beneath it, something is building. What once felt manageable to them emotionally is no longer contained in the same way. The silence that once felt safe now feels heavier. The distance that once felt like control now feels like pressure. And every day they continue to suppress what they feel, the internal weight increases. That is also why their presence seems more noticeable in your life lately. Not because they are deliberately doing anything, but because emotional intensity has a way of echoing outward when it is no longer fully contained. There is a moment people eventually reach when internal resistance begins to collapse. At first, nothing looks different externally. They still go through routines, conversations, obligations, distractions. Everything appears normal from the outside, but internally, everything shifts. Thoughts become harder to silence, emotions rise more easily, memories stop fading and instead become sharper, more persistent. And that is exactly the stage your soulmate has entered. You're no longer just someone they think about occasionally. You have become emotionally unavoidable. You appear in ordinary moments without invitation. A sound, a phrase, a passing reminder can pull them back into you instantly. Quiet environments become difficult because silence amplifies what they are trying not to feel. Even busy environments stop working the way they used to, because beneath every distraction, something deeper continues to surface. This is not them thinking about you consciously all the time. This is something deeper, something that keeps returning on its own. And that is the part they are struggling with most, because the more they try to push the feelings away, the more persistent they become. The more they attempt to regain emotional control, the more clearly their inner world reminds them that this connection is not ordinary. This is also why their behavior may have seemed inconsistent. Moments of closeness followed by withdrawal, brief openness followed by distance, signals that feel mixed or unclear. It is not lack of feeling, it is the presence of feeling they are not fully ready to face. Because emotional distance is often misunderstood. People assume it means absence, but in many cases, it means the feelings became too intense for someone who hasn't yet learned how to hold them safely within themselves. And what you awakened in them is not something simple. You disrupted patterns they had built their sense of emotional stability around. You reached parts of them they had kept dormant for a long time. You brought awareness to emotions they had learned to avoid. And when that happens, internal stability doesn't stay unchanged. At first, they believed they could think their way out of it, that logic would override emotion, that time and distance would naturally weaken the connection. But something unexpected happened instead. Distance didn't reduce the bond, it intensified it. Your absence didn't make you less important. It made your presence inside them louder. And that realization has unsettled them far more than they expected. Because slowly, they are beginning to see what this truly is for them. Not just attraction, not just familiarity, not just emotional curiosity, but significance, emotional significance that doesn't fade easily. And now that truth follows them into everything they do. This is why restlessness has started to build inside them, why their emotional world doesn't feel as stable as it used to, why silence feels heavier than before, why distractions don't fully distract them anymore. Because internally, something keeps pulling them back toward you. And over time, even resistance begins to wear out. At first, they denied it. Then they tried to ignore it. Then they tried controlling it. But now, they are approaching something different. Acceptance is beginning to form. Not complete acceptance yet, but the first real cracks where denial can no longer fully hold. That quiet inner pull that shows up most strongly when everything else is silent. The kind that doesn't need noise or external proof to be felt. This connection is not fading in the way they once assumed it might. Instead, it has entered a stage where emotional reality begins influencing behavior in subtle but noticeable ways. And you may already be sensing those changes. Their attention toward you doesn't feel as scattered anymore. It feels more directed. Their curiosity about your life seems less casual and more emotionally invested. Their energy around you, even when unspoken, feels more active than before. And the emotional weight of your distance is beginning to affect them differently than it used to. That shift is important because what is approaching now is not something that starts from zero. It is something that has been building internally for a long time and is only now becoming visible through action. So when they finally reach out, when they initiate contact, when they express something they have been holding back, it may appear sudden on the surface, but internally, it will be the result of countless private emotional conflicts finally reaching their limit. Nothing about it will truly be spontaneous. It will be release. The release of emotional pressure that has been accumulating for far longer than you can see. And that is why this next phase between you feels different on an energetic level. It is no longer being driven purely by attraction or curiosity. It is being driven by recognition. Recognition that distance has become heavier than honesty. Recognition that suppression is no longer sustainable. Recognition that continuing to resist this connection may cost them something they cannot replace. And recognition, once it fully lands inside the person, changes their internal structure, especially someone who once believed they could stay in full control of their emotions. Because your soulmate is beginning to understand something they resisted for a long time. They cannot control this anymore, not completely, not indefinitely. And once emotional truth reaches that depth, movement becomes unavoidable. That is why the silence between you no longer feels neutral. It feels charged. Not because something external is happening, but because internally, something is preparing to move toward expression. There is a turning point forming where the heart begins choosing honesty over restraint. And that pressure builds quietly in the background of their daily life. If you feel that emotional intensity between you increasing, even without communication, you are not imagining the shift. What your soulmate is experiencing now goes far beyond simple missing. It goes deeper than absence, deeper than attachment, deeper than memory. Because what changed them was not only your presence in their life, but what your presence activated inside them. And that is the part they were never emotionally prepared for. There are people who pass through your life and leave behind memories. And then there are people who enter your life and reshape your entire internal emotional landscape. You became the second kind. Through this connection, something inside them began to awaken. Emotional honesty, longing, vulnerability, reflection, and perhaps most confronting of all, hope. Hope that connection can feel real. Hope that emotional depth can exist safely. Hope that love can be more than surface-level experience or emotional performance. And that kind of awakening is not easy for someone who has spent years building emotional distance as protection. Because many people don't realize how much of their life is lived behind emotional defenses until something reaches them that doesn't respect those defenses at all. Not through force, but through authenticity. That is what happened here. You didn't break through their emotional walls by pushing against them. You bypassed them by being real in a way they were not used to experiencing. And once that happens, emotional numbness stops feeling like home. This is why their resistance became so strong in the first place. Because resistance was the only way they knew how to maintain a sense of control. But here is the deeper truth. When emotional recognition becomes real, sustained denial becomes exhausting. And your soulmate is reaching that exhaustion point. Exhausted from pretending, exhausted from suppressing, exhausted from acting unaffected, exhausted from carrying feelings they cannot logically explain away. That is why their inner world has started feeling unstable lately. One part of them wants to move toward you immediately. Another part still fears what vulnerability might cost them. One part wants clarity before action. Another part already understands that clarity will not come through distance. And this internal conflict is intensifying over time, not easing. Because the longer emotional truth is held back, the louder it becomes internally. That is why thoughts of you appear without warning, why memories feel emotionally alive instead of distant, why ordinary moments suddenly carry emotional triggers connected to you, why even in their attempts to move forward, something inside them continues to turn back toward your presence. This is not random. It is emotional pressure finding ways to surface. And eventually, pressure that is not released does only one thing. It moves. This connection has already taken root inside them in a way they can no longer ignore. And deep down, they are beginning to recognize that truth. That recognition is what is shifting everything now. This is not fantasy in their mind anymore. It is not a passing attraction they can dismiss or reset. It is recognition, deep emotional recognition. The awareness that your presence touched something within them that is rarely activated more than once in a lifetime. And that realization is humbling them, because they are starting to face something uncomfortable. They may have almost walked away from something real without fully understanding its depth at the time. And people rarely grasp the true weight of emotional truth until they feel what it means to potentially lose it for good. That possibility is now sitting heavily within them. The thought that you might eventually stop waiting emotionally. The thought that someone else could receive the depth they were meant to experience with you. The thought that you might continue growing, evolving, and healing without them becoming part of your story anymore. These realizations are not loud on the surface, but internally they are deeply unsettling. Because underneath all hesitation, one truth is becoming impossible for them to deny. They do not want to lose you. Not emotionally, not permanently, not completely. And that fear is beginning to override the emotional defenses they once relied on. This is why their awareness of you feels sharper now. Their attention is no longer passive, it is observant. They are more aware of your presence, your emotional state, your energy, trying to read what still exists between you. Trying to understand whether there is still emotional space left for them in your life. Because now they realize something important. Their silence created distance. Their hesitation created separation. Their fear delayed something that mattered. And with that realization comes urgency. An urgency that grows quietly but steadily each day. Which is why their next move may come sooner than expected, not because everything inside them is resolved, but because continuing to avoid you is becoming emotionally unsustainable. At this stage, their return, if it happens, will not simply be about desire. It will come from awakening, a deeper emotional awakening. They are beginning to see what this connection truly meant. They are beginning to feel what your absence has done internally. They are beginning to understand how hollow life feels when emotional truth is missing. And when a person reaches that level of awareness, silence becomes harder to maintain, especially when the possibility exists that the other person may move forward without them. That realization creates emotional acceleration. It pushes people toward honesty, toward expression, toward action they previously avoided. Your soulmate is approaching that threshold now, the point where fear of regret starts becoming stronger than fear of vulnerability. And when that happens, movement becomes inevitable. Because in every intense emotional bond, there comes a point where internal resistance can no longer compete with emotional truth. And your soulmate is reaching that point. Not gradually anymore, not subtly anymore, but in a way they can clearly feel internally. The emotional walls they relied on for stability are beginning to weaken under the weight of everything they have been holding inside. And what often breaks a person's resistance is not a single dramatic moment, it is accumulation. Accumulated longing, accumulated memories, accumulated absence, accumulated emotional suppression. That is what has been building within them over time. Every attempt to distract themselves, every effort to move on emotionally, every attempt to rationalize distance has slowly failed to hold its ground. And now, a deeper realization is forming within them. You are not replaceable. That understanding carries emotional weight that changes everything internally, because once someone realizes a connection cannot simply be substituted or recreated elsewhere, emotional urgency begins to surface. Not in an obvious way, but quietly, through thoughts that return without permission, through memories that feel more alive than distant, through moments where your presence interrupts their focus unexpectedly. A subtle inner question begins to repeat itself. What if I lose them completely? And that question starts influencing their emotional behavior from within. Outwardly, they may still appear composed, but internally, emotional pressure is building toward a breaking point, because they now understand something they avoided facing before. Your absence is no longer just distance, it is emotional loss. An emotional loss eventually forces honesty out of people, especially those who once believed there was always more time. At first, they assumed this connection would remain accessible indefinitely, that there would always be another chance, another moment, another opportunity later. But distance changed that perception. Now they are beginning to sense something different. You are not standing still emotionally. You are evolving, changing, moving forward. And that realization intensifies their feelings instead of reducing them, because nothing sharpens emotional awareness like the possibility of permanent loss. That possibility has become real to them, not in imagination, but in feeling, and it unsettles them deeply. Not because they fear solitude in general, but because they fear life without you specifically. That difference matters, because you have become emotionally irreplaceable in their inner world. And once that realization settles in, resistance begins to collapse. This is why they keep circling back to you in thought, why they cannot fully disconnect, why your presence keeps resurfacing inside them even when they try to move away from it. Because emotionally, something inside them has already chosen you long before their mind stopped resisting. And now their mind is beginning to catch up. That is why whatever they do next will carry emotional weight, not because it is impulsive, but because it is the result of accumulated realization finally reaching expression. They are beginning to understand. They feel more than they admitted. Distance did not solve anything. Every attempt to move away still led them back internally to you. And that realization is overwhelming for someone who tried so hard to stay in control. There is also something else emerging now. Regret. Not destructive regret, but emotional clarity mixed with awareness of delay. They are replaying moments internally. Conversations, silences, missed chances, times they pulled back instead of leaning in, times they chose fear over connection. And through that reflection, they are finally seeing this bond without distortion, not through avoidance, not through ego, not through fear, but through truth. And that truth is humbling them, because they are realizing that what you gave them was real, sincere, consistent, emotionally honest, and instead of fully trusting it, they resisted it. And that realization carries emotional weight that grows stronger in quiet moments, especially at night, especially when distractions fade and the mind is left alone with what it has been avoiding. Because once someone experiences a connection at that depth, ordinary emotional experiences stop feeling complete in the same way. And now they know exactly what is missing. That awareness is what eventually breaks resistance completely. Not pressure, not force, not external influence, but truth. Pure emotional truth. And truth, once fully recognized, cannot stay suppressed forever. That is why their next move may feel sudden on the surface, but internally it will be the result of everything finally reaching its limit. And when that moment comes, it will not be shaped by confusion anymore. It will be shaped by clarity. Clarity, formed through longing, absence, reflection, and emotional transformation. The realization that some connections are too meaningful to lose to fear. And now they are approaching the final stage of that realization, where resisting what they feel becomes harder than expressing it, where fear of loss becomes stronger than fear of vulnerability. And when that shift completes, movement becomes not just possible, but inevitable. This is exactly why their next move carries real emotional weight. It won't just be a sudden reaction or a passing impulse. It will be the outcome of a long internal process finally arriving at clarity, a point where truth can no longer stay buried. The truth that you matter to them more than they ever allowed themselves to admit. The truth that your absence didn't reduce your importance, it revealed it. The truth that distance didn't weaken the connection, it clarified it. And the truth that the idea of you becoming a regret rather than a presence in their life is something they can no longer ignore. That realization has a way of shaking people awake. And once someone is emotionally awakened in that way, they don't interact with life the same anymore. They become more careful with words, more aware of connection, more conscious of loss, less willing to take emotional presence for granted. Your soulmate has been going through that internal shift quietly through this separation. That is why the energy around this connection feels different lately. It is no longer static. It feels like something is building toward expression, something that has been contained for too long. Because suppressed emotion does not remain silent forever. At some point, it starts pushing toward expression on its own. And that is when people begin moving again, reaching out, reconsidering, reopening communication, looking for reasons to reconnect, even if they cannot fully explain why. Not because fear disappears completely, but because it stops being stronger than what they feel. That is the real shift happening internally. At the same time, something important often gets overlooked in connections like this. Both people change. This experience has not only been shaping them, it has been shaping you as well. You've learned how to sit with uncertainty without losing your sense of self. You've learned how to feel deeply without chasing what is unclear. You've learned how to trust your intuition even when external confirmation was missing. And you've learned that your value does not disappear in silence or distance. Those realizations are not small. They change how you relate to love entirely. And because of that growth on both sides, what comes next has the potential to unfold differently than what came before. Not from confusion, not from emotional imbalance, but from awareness. When two people reconnect after genuine emotional development, the dynamic shifts. It becomes less reactive, less unstable, more intentional. There is more clarity in how feelings are expressed, more grounding in how connection is handled. And that is the direction this energy is moving toward. What is forming now is not surface attraction or temporary emotional excitement. It is something closer to emotional certainty, the quiet internal acknowledgement that this connection is not something that can be dismissed anymore. That kind of realization changes behavior. It reduces hesitation. It replaces avoidance with reflection. It turns silence into awareness, and eventually it turns awareness into action. So what you may begin to notice first are subtle changes, a more deliberate presence, a more intentional reach, a softer kind of attention returning. Moments where reconnecting starts to feel less avoidable for them. Not because they suddenly became fearless, but because the internal resistance is no longer sustainable. And when that point is reached, truth starts coming through in ways that can no longer be fully hidden. A message that carries more meaning than before. A conversation that feels different in tone.